Malaika's wedding necklace snapped at the exact moment the dying CEO's body stopped moving. The women behind her gasped. One of them whispered that it was a curse. Another muttered that the poor girl had brought death into the room before the marriage bed had even turned cold. Malaika stood frozen in the candlelit chamber, still wearing the white gown her family had forced onto her, while Tendaji Okoye lay motionless against the silk pillows, his skin grey, his breathing gone. Then his fingers twitched. Just once. And beneath the heavy scent of incense and flowers, Malaika caught something else bitter, sharp, wrong. Not the smell of illness, the smell of poison. Before we go on, tell me this: if your own family forced you to marry a man everyone believed was about to die, would you run for your life or stay and uncover the truth? And where are you watching from today? Drop your country and local time in the comments. If you love emotional, powerful stories filled with shocking twists, justice and healing, subscribe and stay with us. By morning, the wedding flowers already smelled like rot. The mansion of the Okoye family stood above the city like a polished monument to power all white stone mirrored windows and iron gates, so tall they seemed built to keep judgment out. Malaika had never seen a place like it up close. In the village where she had grown up, doors were made to let air in. Here, every door looked made to keep truth trapped. She stepped out of the black car with one small bag in her hand and the weight of the night still pressing on her chest. Nobody welcomed her. No smiling relatives, no blessing, no warm hand on her shoulder. Only two maids in grey uniforms standing stiff as poles and a butler whose face revealed absolutely nothing. The air itself felt wrong, not because the house was quiet. Rich houses were often quiet. But this silence was disciplined, trained. A silence made by fear. The butler bowed slightly. "Madame Malaika. This way. Madame." The word almost made her laugh. 12 hours earlier, her father had refused to look at her while signing the final marriage papers. Her half-sister Zainabu had watched from the doorway with cold relief in her eyes, relieved that the cursed role had fallen to someone else. Her stepmother had adjusted Malaika's veil like she was wrapping merchandise for delivery. No one had called her daughter. No one had asked if she was afraid. But now, inside the Okoye mansion, strangers would call her madam while treating her like a temporary ghost. She followed the butler through a hall lined with oil paintings and gold-framed photographs. Tendaji Okoye appeared in nearly all of them at ribbon cuttings beside presidents in business magazines at charity galas. In each picture he looked commanding, composed a man carved out of certainty, not the pale, motionless figure she had seen beneath candlelight hours ago. At the end of the corridor, the butler opened a pair of double doors. "The family is waiting." The family. That word felt even more dangerous. Inside the breakfast room, silver gleamed in the morning sun. Crystal glasses caught the light. The table was long enough to host a negotiation between nations. At its center sat a woman in deep green silk, elegant and perfectly still, as if she had been arranged there before dawn. Madame Ifeyinwa. She rose with graceful slowness and came forward with both arms open. Her perfume soft and expensive, her smile almost maternal. "My dear child," she said warmly, taking Malaika's hands, "you must be exhausted. Last night was difficult for all of us." For all of us. The lie was so smooth it almost sounded kind. Malaika lowered her eyes. "Yes, ma'am." "Not ma'am," Ifeyinwa said, smiling wider. "Mother." The room changed temperature. Malaika felt it before she understood it. A tiny shift in the faces of the people seated behind the polished table. A flicker of amusement. A curl of contempt. This was not affection. It was theater. A young man at the far end leaned back in his chair, one arm spread carelessly over the polished wood. His suit fit him too well. His smile fit him badly. Jelani. So this is the bride, he said, studying Malaika openly. You look younger than I expected. I am old enough to be here, Malaika answered quietly. He laughed. That remains to be seen. Ifeyinwa gave him a mild look, the kind mothers used when pretending to correct children they secretly encouraged. Jelani has no manners before coffee. Sit, dear. Malaika sat where she was directed, halfway down the table, far enough from the center to understand her rank. A servant placed tea before her. Another set down breadfruit, eggs, grilled fish pastries warm from the oven. More food than her family had seen in a week, perhaps 2. Yet no one truly ate. They moved pieces around their plates. They watched each other. They watched her. Finally, Ifeyinwa folded her hands. You are now Mrs. Okoye. That means dignity, discipline, discretion. My son's condition is private. His recovery, if heaven grants one, will also be private. You will not speak to the media. You will not entertain visitors without approval. You will not wander into matters that do not concern you. Malaika lifted her gaze, and my husband Ifeyinwa's expression softened just enough to be dangerous. You will do exactly what you were brought here to do. Brought here, not married, not welcomed, brought. Jelani took a sip of coffee. Stay at his bedside. Look devoted. Pray where people can see you. It helps the public narrative. The public narrative. For one sharp second, anger burned away Malaika's fear. You speak as if he is already dead, she said. The silence that followed was brief, but revealing. Jelani smiled first. I speak as a realist. Ifeyinwa dabbed her lips with a napkin. Tendaji has been suffering a very long time. We all cope in different ways. Malaika thought of the twitch she had seen in his hand, the bitter smell in the room, the grayness of his skin after the medicine had been administered. Something cold moved under her ribs. A third voice entered the room, smooth and clinical. The bride should avoid emotional strain. Malaika turned. A tall man in a cream suit had entered without anyone announcing him. His face was pleasant in the way locked doors were pleasant, polished, impersonal, impossible to read. Dr. Chikele, Ifeyinwa said. Perfect timing. So this was the private doctor. He approached the table with a nod. Mrs. Okoye, I have overseen Mr. Okoye's care for 7 months. His condition is extremely delicate. His body is failing. The mind may occasionally respond, but you must not be misled. Moments of motion do not mean recovery. The words were neutral. Too neutral. Malaika looked straight at him. What illness does he have? A pause. Complications of a degenerative neurological disorder. What disorder? Another pause. This one smaller, more dangerous. The exact classification is complex. Jelani snorted softly into his cup. Malaika heard it. So did Ifeyinwa. Dr. Ifeyinwa said lightly, perhaps the details can wait. The poor girl has had enough shocks for one day. Poor girl. There it was again. The room's real opinion slipping through silk. Breakfast ended with no formal dismissal, only a gradual rising chairs sliding back. Servants appearing and people leaving as if the conversation had already been decided somewhere before she entered. Ifeyinwa touched Malaika's arm on her way out. You will stay in the east wing near Tendaji's room. It is practical. She paused. And Malaika, grief can make young wives imaginative. Do not upset yourself by inventing hope where there is none. Then she left. Not long after, Malaika was led upstairs by one of the maids, a thin woman with cautious eyes and a scar hidden near her temple. She introduced herself only as Sadeh. Her voice was barely above a whisper. This wing is restricted, she said. Some rooms remain locked. If anyone asks, you are to say you spent the morning praying. Why would anyone ask that Sadeh hesitated? Because everyone asks everything in this house. They passed Tendaji's room. 2 security men stood outside. The doors were closed. I want to see my husband. Sade's steps faltered. The doctor is inside. Then I will wait. She did not wait. Something in her, something beaten thin by fear in her family home, then stretched tighter by the mansion's false smiles, suddenly refused to bend. She walked straight past the guards before they fully understood what she was doing. Madam, she pushed through the doors. The curtains were half drawn, filtering the sunlight into weak strips. The room smelled of antiseptic lilies and that same bitter edge she had noticed the night before. Tendaji lay in bed, pale and still. Dr. Chikele stood beside him, preparing a syringe from a tray of labeled medicines. He turned so sharply that one glass vial clicked against another. Mrs. Okoye, he said too evenly. You should have knocked. Malaika did not answer. She walked closer, eyes fixed on the tray. Bottles, capsules, ampules, handwritten dosage notes, one amber bottle with its label partly torn. She looked at Tendaji's face, then at the medicine. What are you giving him? A sedative. He is unconscious. He is in pain. How do you know? The doctor's jaw tightened by a fraction. Because I am a physician. Malaika stepped closer to the bed and gently touched Tendaji's wrist. His skin was cool, but not lifeless. His pulse was faint. Too faint. Then, under her fingers, it stumbled. A skip. A drag. And just as the doctor moved the syringe toward the IV line, Tendaji's eyelids trembled. It lasted less than a second. But Malaika saw it. So did the doctor. He adjusted his expression instantly. Too instantly. Reflex, he said. She stared at him. You said movement means nothing. It usually means nothing. Usually. The word opened a crack. Malaika bent closer to Tendaji and noticed a damp ring on the sheet near his hand. His untouched medicine from the night before had spilled there. The fabric beneath it was stained faint yellow. She leaned lower. That smell again. Bitter. Metallic. Wrong. Not like herbs. Not like any medicine her grandmother had used. It reminded her, instead of crushed seeds from a poisonous vine that grew near the riverbank back home, something the village children were warned never to touch with bare mouths. She straightened slowly. Has he gotten worse after every dose, she asked? The doctor set the syringe down with controlled care. Mrs. Okoye, grief and ignorance are a dangerous combination. Malaika heard the insult, accepted it, stored it. Then she looked at Tendaji one more time. The room was too polished, the doctor too calm, the family too ready. Everyone had already buried him in their speech before the body was gone. Everyone except the body itself. As she turned to leave, Sade appeared in the doorway carrying fresh linens. Her eyes flicked once toward the tray, once toward Malaika, then quickly down. That one glance said more than a confession. Later in the small bedroom they had given her, Malaika found no comfort in the soft mattress, or the silk curtains, or the balcony overlooking the gardens. Wealth did not soften danger. Sometimes it merely decorated it. She unpacked her one bag in silence, 2 dresses, a faded scarf, a prayer book, and a small cloth pouch containing dried leaves and roots her grandmother had taught her to carry for fever, nausea, weakness. A knock came at the door after sunset. When she opened it, no one stood there, only a covered tray on the floor. She lifted the cloth. Underneath lay a simple cup of tea and a folded scrap of paper. Her breath caught as she opened it. The handwriting was shaky, hurried. If you want to live, do not trust anyone in this house, especially the man who holds the medicines. Malaika looked up at the empty corridor. No footsteps, no shadows, nothing. But for the first time since arriving, the fear inside her changed shape. It was no longer helpless fear. It was direction. Somewhere inside this mansion, someone was watching. Someone was waiting. And someone knew Tendaji Okoye was not merely dying. He was being kept that way. The storm began just after midnight. Wind pressed against the tall windows of the east wing, making the glass hum inside its frame. Rain lashed the mansion in sudden violent sheets, and somewhere far below, thunder rolled over the city like a warning too large for words. Most of the house had gone dark. The servants had withdrawn. The polished corridors had emptied. Even the security guards outside Tendaji's room looked duller at that hour, their alertness softened by routine, their confidence fed by the belief that a dying man could do nothing and a frightened bride would dare even less. They were wrong about one of those things. Malaika sat on the edge of her bed with the folded warning note in her hand for the 10th time. Do not trust anyone in this house, especially the man who holds the medicines. Her mind had been circling the same questions for hours. Who had left it Sade? Another servant, someone inside the family, and if the warning was real, why warn her at all? Why not go to the police? Why not expose it? Because powerful families buried truth faster than strangers could speak it. She already knew that much. Her own father had sold her into this mansion with a straight face and a prayer on his lips. Her stepmother had called it sacrifice. Zainabu had called it fate. They had all wrapped greed in respectable words until it looked holy. A sharp crack of thunder shook the room. Malaika stood. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the corridor. The lamps along the wall cast low, golden pools across the carpet. Tendaji's room sat at the end of the hall, guarded as always. But tonight, only one man was outside, seated on a chair with his chin dipping toward his chest. Asleep. Or close enough. Malaika walked softly, heart pounding. When she reached the door, she paused, listening. Nothing. She eased it open. The room was dim except for the blue pulse of the heart monitor, and a single bedside lamp left burning low. The curtains swayed slightly from the pressure of the storm outside. Tendaji lay where he always lay, beneath a blanket the color of smoke, his face pale against the pillow. The tray of medicines stood on the side table, neatly arranged, as if illness itself had manners. Malaika closed the door behind her. For a moment she simply stood there, watching him. Without the daylight, without the doctor, without Aifayinwa's controlled sorrow, the room felt different, less like a sick room, more like a stage after the audience had left, a place where the performance had stopped, but the danger had not. She approached the tray. 3 bottles, 2 blister packs, 1 small glass vial, an injection labeled with handwriting too rushed to be elegant. She picked up the amber bottle with the torn label and uncapped it carefully. The smell rose at once, bitter, sharp, metallic. Wrong. Her grandmother had taught her the language of plants before she could read, not with charts or polished names, but with scent, stain, and effect. This leaf cooled fever. That root steadied the stomach. This bark soothed pain when boiled long enough. And this seed, never touch, never taste, never grind it near food. Too much, and the pulse would stagger like a drunk man in a ditch. Malaika tipped 1 drop onto a folded handkerchief. The liquid dried in a pale yellow ring, just like the mark she had seen on the sheet. Her breathing became shallow. So she had not imagined it. A sound behind her froze her in place. Who are you? The voice was rough, almost broken from disuse, but unmistakably alive. Malaika turned so fast the bottle nearly slipped from her fingers. Tendaji's eyes were open, not fully, not strongly, but open. For 1 suspended second, neither of them moved. The storm hammered the windows. The monitor clicked out its indifferent rhythm. Tendaji stared at her with the dazed intensity of a man surfacing from deep water and finding a stranger already standing in his room. Malaika set the bottle down carefully. My name is Malaika. His lips parted as if the word cost him effort. You're real. She almost laughed from shock. I should say the same to you. His gaze shifted weakly toward the tray, then back to her face. Even drained and skeletal, he still carried traces of the man from the portraits, sharp cheekbones, controlled eyes, a mind that had once commanded entire rooms. But now that force flickered behind exhaustion and pain. How long, he whispered. I don't know. His throat worked. They said, episodes, memory gaps. You remember this moment? I remember enough. His eyes narrowed slightly. Who sent you? No one sent me. My family forced me to marry you yesterday. A long pause followed. Then, with terrible faintness, he said, so they finally did it. The words settled heavily between them. Malaika stepped closer. You knew, not you. He swallowed with difficulty. The plan. A wife with no power, no allies. Someone poor enough to obey, easy to discredit, easy to erase later. Malaika felt cold move through her bones. Why would they need a wife at all? His eyes drifted toward the ceiling for a moment, gathering strength. Inheritance, signatures, public sympathy, board stability. A dying man married looks controlled. A dying man alone raises questions. The storm flashed white across the windows. For one instant, his face glowed ghost pale in the light. You believe someone is trying to kill you, she said. A humorless shadow moved across his expression. I believed it before I stopped being able to stand. He tried to shift and winced sharply. Malaika moved at once to support his shoulder. He tensed under her touch, then seemed to realize she was helping, not restraining. Slowly, she murmured. He studied her face as if searching for the price behind her kindness. Men like him had probably spent years being served by people who wanted something, protected by people who negotiated affection like contracts. Distrust sat in him like an old habit. You should leave, he said. If you've understood even half of this, you should run. I would have run yesterday, Malaika answered. Today I found poison on your medicine tray. His eyes sharpened. There, she said, pointing to the amber bottle. Every time that smell appears, your pulse drops. I noticed it last night. Again this morning. He looked at the bottle for a long moment. Dr. Chikele. It was not a question. Malaika nodded once. Tendaji closed his eyes briefly, as if the confirmation hurt less than the certainty. When he opened them again, his voice was low. How many people know I'm awake? Only me. And whoever left you the warning. That startled her. How did you know? His mouth moved in the faintest hint of a smile. Because nobody comes this far on courage alone. Someone pushed. Malaika hesitated, then reached into her pocket and showed him the folded note. He read it slowly, his breathing uneven. Sade, he said at last. You're sure no? But she served my mother before Aifayinwa took over the house. If anyone still remembers what loyalty means, it may be her. Malaika absorbed that quietly. My mother Tendaji said after a moment, voice thinner now, used to keep records of everything. Every transfer, every meeting, every conversation she thought might matter later. She trusted paper more than people. Where are those records? If they still exist. His gaze shifted toward the bookshelf across the room. There's a false panel behind the lower cabinet. Left side. I had it built after she died. Malaika stared. You hid something there? He gave one tiny nod. Insurance. She crossed the room immediately and knelt before the cabinet. At first she saw nothing but carved wood and polished brass. Then her fingers brushed a small groove beneath the molding. She pressed. A narrow section clicked inward. Behind it lay a flat, black folder sealed in plastic. Malaika pulled it out and turned back to him. His eyes had already fallen half shut with effort. "What is this?" "Copies," he whispered. "Old letters. Board memos. An unsigned revision to my will. Names I didn't trust." Malaika held the folder like a live thing. "Listen carefully," Tendaji forced out. "If they know I woke, they'll move faster. Chikale will change the drugs. Jelani will push the board. Ifeyinwa will cry in public and bury me in private." The bluntness of it made her stomach tighten. "What do we do?" For the first time since she had entered the room, Tendaji looked at her not as a stranger, not as a purchased bride, but as a possible ally. "First," he said, "I need to stay alive long enough to become inconvenient." Despite everything, a breath of disbelief escaped her. "That sounds like something a CEO would say." A faint glint of the old man returned to his eyes. "It is." Then his breathing faltered. Malaika saw it instantly. The pulse monitor stumbled. His fingers twitched against the blanket. She moved to the tray, snatched up the prescription chart, and scanned the time markings. Another dose was due within minutes. No, not tonight. She grabbed a glass of water from the bedside table and reached into the cloth pouch she always carried. From it she took 2 dried leaves and a shaving of bitter root. Her grandmother's emergency mixture, not a cure, never a cure, but something to slow toxic shock and steady a collapsing pulse if given early enough. She crushed the leaves between her fingers and dropped them into the water. Tendaji watched through half-lidded eyes. "What is that?" "Something from home." She lifted his head gently. "And tonight, home may save you better than your doctor." He should have resisted. A powerful man in a room full of enemies should not have trusted a woman he had met minutes earlier. But exhaustion had stripped away pride, and truth recognized truth faster than comfort did. He drank. Only a little. But enough. Malaika set the glass down and waited. 10 seconds. 20. 30. The monitor still stumbled, but then it began to even out, not strong, not safe, but less jagged than before. Tendaji's breathing deepened by one fragile degree. Relief hit her so sharply it almost hurt. He saw it on her face. "You really are trying to save me." The words were simple. Yet beneath them lay surprise so old and deep it nearly broke her heart. "Yes," she said. "Why?" "Because no one had saved her when they should have. Because she knew what it was to be traded by blood. Because truth, once seen, became a burden if ignored. Because leaving him to die would make her family, this house, and everyone inside it write about what powerless people eventually become. But she gave him the smallest answer. Because you're not dead yet." Another flicker of that weak, incredulous smile. Outside, thunder rolled across the city again. Inside, something shifted. Not safety, not victory, not even trust fully formed, but the beginning of a pact. Malaika slid the folder beneath her shawl and blew out the lamp beside the bed, leaving only the monitor's blue light in the room. From now on, she whispered, "You take nothing unless I see it first." Tendaji's eyes were closing again, whether from fatigue or the herbs she could not tell. But before sleep dragged him under, he murmured one final sentence. "Then from now on, I trust only you." Malaika stood beside the bed, listening to the storm and to the fragile rhythm of a man the entire house had already buried. By dawn, she understood one thing with terrifying clarity. She was no longer merely a bride trapped in a rich man's mansion. She was the only thing standing between Tendaji Okoye and the people waiting for him to die. Morning came with the false gentleness of sunlight on polished floors. The storm had scrubbed the sky clean, and from the windows of the east wing the city looked bright, almost innocent. But inside the Okoye mansion nothing felt washed. The danger had only changed clothes. Malaika had not slept. She sat in the small chair near her bedroom window, still wearing yesterday's dress, the black plastic folder hidden beneath the loose floorboard she had found behind the curtains just before dawn. Every few minutes she heard footsteps in the corridor and stiffened. Every knock of a servant's tray against a door sounded like a warning. Every distant murmur seemed sharpened by the knowledge that one wrong look, one wrong word could expose everything. Tendaji was alive, barely secretly, dangerously alive, and because he was Elam, everyone around him was even more dangerous than before. A maid came at 7 with tea and bread. It was not Sade. Madame Ifeyinwa requests your presence in the family chapel, the girl said, eyes lowered. Of course she did. Nothing in this house happened without calculation. Ifeyinwa would want prayer now. Public grief. Visible devotion. A poor bride kneeling prettily before God while the household prepared for power. Malaika washed, changed, and tied her scarf carefully. When she looked into the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Her face seemed older than it had 3 days ago. Her eyes looked less afraid, more alert. Fear had not left her. It had simply learned to stand upright. The family chapel was smaller than the rest of the mansion, but richer than any church in her village. White candles lined the walls in brass holders. Sunlight spilled through colored glass, staining the marble floor in red, blue, and gold. At the front, Madame Ifeyinwa knelt gracefully in black silk, a picture of elegant suffering. Beside her stood Jelani. Not kneeling, never kneeling, hands folded behind his back, as if even in prayer he expected the room to obey him. A priest murmured blessings. 3 women from the extended family dabbed at their eyes with embroidered cloths, and there, right in the front row, stood a face Malaika had not expected to see again so soon. Her father, Moses Kalu. He wore his best suit, the brown one he saved for funerals, weddings, and meetings where money might change hands. His shoes were freshly polished. His posture was humble in the way greedy men became humble in rich houses. Next to him stood her half-sister Zainabu. Wrapped in expensive fabric she could never have bought herself. She did not look sorrowful. She looked curious. Malaika stopped walking. The priest's voice continued. Ifeyinwa turned, slowly noticed her, and smiled with controlled sweetness. Ah, she said softly, as if the reunion were natural. Your family arrived at dawn to support you in this difficult time. Support. The word struck Malaika like a slap. Moses opened his arms slightly. My daughter. She did not move. Zainabu's mouth tightened, by 1 degree annoyed that the performance was not proceeding smoothly. The priest finished his prayer and withdrew with a bow. The relatives drifted back. The servants disappeared. Within seconds, the chapel became what it had always truly been, a private room for manipulation. Ifeyinwa touched Malaika's arm. I thought it would comfort you to see your people. My people, Malaika repeated quietly. Moses cleared his throat. We came as soon as we heard that my son-in-law had worsened. The lie was immediate, effortless. Malaika stared at him. You knew his condition before the wedding. A warning flickered in his eyes. Not guilt. Warning. Malaika, he said through a strained smile. This is not the place. No, she answered. It is exactly the place. A chapel is where people come to speak in front of God. The room sharpened around them. Jelani watched with open interest now, like a man discovering unexpected entertainment at breakfast. Ifeyinwa stepped back half a pace. She was listening more closely than anyone. Moses lowered his voice. Mind yourself. There it was. The same command from childhood. Mind yourself while others lied. Mind yourself while others took. Mind yourself while silence was demanded from the one being wounded. For years she had obeyed. Not today. You signed the papers, Malaika said. You did not even ask me if I agreed. You told the elders it was a blessing. You said I should be grateful. His face hardened. Because it was better than what awaited you otherwise. Better. Her voice stayed low, but every word came out clean. You sold me to a dying man. Zainabu stepped in at once, offended by the ugliness of truth when spoken aloud. Watch how you speak to father. You act as if you were chosen for suffering alone. We all make sacrifices. Malaika turned to her sister slowly. Then why didn't you make this one silence, pure, beautiful, damning silence? Zainabu's nostrils flared. Because I was not suitable. No, Malaika said. Because you were afraid. Moses cut in sharply. Enough! But once truth entered a room, it did not leave because a man raised his voice. Malaika looked from his face to Zainabu's and saw it clearly now, not just betrayal, but arrangement. Not just cruelty, but planning. Pieces moved deliberately. People chosen according to usefulness. How much, she asked. Moses blinked. What? How much did they pay you? He stared at her as if the question itself were vulgar. That was how men like him protected themselves, by pretending that greed became respectable if never counted aloud. Ifeyinwa intervened with a sigh, soft enough to seem compassionate. Perhaps everyone is overtired. Malaika grief can make the wounded suspicious. Malaika turned to her. And does greed make the comfortable deaf? Jelani laughed. It was the worst possible sound in that moment. Smooth, delighted, cruel. Well, he said the village bride has more spine than expected. Moses looked embarrassed now, not by what he had done, by the fact that it was being exposed before richer people. Malaika, he said tightly, your marriage has already taken place. Do not create shame where honor has already been secured. Honor. That word almost broke something in her. She took one step closer to him. You gave me away to men who expected my husband to die. You did not protect me. You did not tell me the truth. And now you stand in a chapel and speak of honor. Zainabu folded her arms. You always were dramatic. Malaika looked at her for a long second. No, I was always the one you thought would stay quiet. Something passed through Ifeyinwa's expression, then something quick and calculating. She had learned something useful. Family weakness, a fracture line. Evidence that Malaika had no real backing outside this house. That made her both easier to isolate and more dangerous, because isolated people either broke or became unpredictable. Moses finally dropped the pretense of tenderness. His voice turned flat. This arrangement benefited everyone. Your husband needed a wife. We needed security. You needed a future. Do not act above the station you came from. The words landed with brutal precision, perhaps because he no longer cared who heard, or perhaps because rich walls encouraged poor men to become honest about their ugliness. Malaika's hands shook once, then stopped. She understood something essential in that instant. He would never apologize because he did not believe he had sinned. In his mind, daughters were assets, suffering was strategy. And survival belonged to those willing to sell someone weaker first. And if she had still needed proof that she had no home to return to, that proof now stood in front of her in a good suit with polished shoes. Ifeyinwa moved in silk, whispering across the floor. Moses, perhaps we should all show more grace. Your daughter is under immense strain. Grace Malaika said, eyes still on her father. Is that what you call it in this house when people are used and buried? Jelani's amusement faded slightly. That line had gone too close to something real. Moses seized the chance to regain control. Listen carefully, he said under his breath. Do not become difficult. Families like this do not forgive embarrassment. Stay obedient. Tendaji will pass soon, and when matters are settled, you will be taken care of. Taken care of. As if she were livestock to be transferred after sale. Her stomach turned cold. He knew. Not every detail, perhaps not the poison, not the full plan, but enough. Enough to speak of Tendaji's death not as possibility but schedule. "You expected him to die quickly," she said. Moses glanced toward Ifeyinwa, then away too late. That glance told her everything. No contract had been merely verbal. No understanding had been vague. There had been discussion, agreement, terms. And Zainabu knew too. Malaika saw it in the stillness that had come over her half-sister's face. The stillness of a woman who realized the wrong sister had become dangerous. Before anyone else could speak, footsteps echoed from the corridor. Sade appeared in the doorway, breathing hard enough to suggest she had walked quickly, though she kept her face respectfully lowered. "Madam," she said to Malaika, "the doctor asks for you at Mr. Okoye's room." At once, Ifeyinwa's eyes sharpened. "Why?" she asked. Sade bowed slightly. "He said Mr. Okoye's condition changed after the night medicines. He wants the wife informed. A trap? Perhaps. Or a test. But it also offered escape." Malaika inclined her head. "Then I should go." Moses reached for her wrist. The old reflex made her body stiffen before her mind did. He had held her like that as a child when he wanted obedience in public and punishment in private. This time, she pulled free. Not violently, not theatrically, simply and completely. His hand remained hanging in the air for one humiliating second. The chapel saw it. Jelani saw it. Ifeyinwa certainly saw it. And something in the balance shifted. Malaika stepped back. "Do not touch me again unless you are ready to explain before everyone here why you sold your daughter to a dying man." Moses's face drained, then darkened. Zainabu opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Ifeyinwa's smile returned softer now, thinner. "Family wounds should not be displayed carelessly," she said. Malaika looked straight at her. Then perhaps families should stop making them. Without waiting for permission, she turned and walked out of the chapel beside Sade. They moved quickly through the corridor. Neither spoke until they reached the turning near the staircase, and the voices behind them had faded. Then Sade whispered, "That was dangerous." Malaika kept walking. "I know. You should not have said those things in front of them." Malaika stopped. "No," she said quietly. "I should have heard them years ago." Sade glanced around to be sure they were alone, then leaned closer. Her scar caught the light for a moment beneath her headscarf. "I heard part of what your father said," she murmured. "Enough to know this: if Madame Ifeyinwa thinks your family can still control you, she will use them. If she thinks they cannot, she may remove them from the game." Malaika felt a chill crawl up her back. Remove Sade did not answer directly. That was answer enough. They reached Tendaji's door. The guard stepped aside at once. Before entering, Malaika touched the hidden edge of her sleeve, where the small key from the false cabinet pressed against her skin. She had tucked it there before leaving her room, trusting nothing. Now, not walls, not smiles, not prayer, and certainly not blood. Her father had given her the truth she needed, even if he had meant it as control. She had not been sent here by accident. She had been selected, chosen because she was poor, isolated, disposable, and expected to stay grateful while powerful people waited for a man to die. But they had made one mistake. They had mistaken silence for weakness. Malaika pushed open the door to Tendaji's room, with a heart harder than it had been an hour earlier. By the time she crossed the threshold, one thing had become brutally clear. The Okoye family was not the only family she would have to survive. Dr. Chikale was not alone when Malaika entered. 2 nurses stood near the windows adjusting equipment that did not seem to need adjusting. A junior physician she had never seen before was reviewing a chart at the foot of the bed with exaggerated seriousness. The room felt staged, too many hands, too much motion, too much careful professionalism arranged like flowers around danger. And in the middle of it all lay Tendaji once again pale and still, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow enough to invite pity. Only Malaika knew better. Only she knew that behind that stillness was a man measuring every word spoken above his body. Dr. Chikole turned toward her with a face trained into concern. "Mrs. Okoye, thank you for coming so quickly." "What happened?" she asked. "Some instability after the overnight interval." His tone was smooth. "Nothing unusual for a case this advanced, but we may need to increase sedation. Restlessness is common before terminal decline." Malaika felt the sentence like a blade wrapped in cloth. Increase sedation. Restlessness. Terminal decline. He spoke in medical language, the way some men used perfume to cover a smell they hoped others would not detect. She moved to the bedside without asking permission. Tendaji's hand lay on the blanket, thin and cool. She touched it lightly. No visible response. But under her fingers his pulse gave one faint, deliberate double beat, alive, listening, alive. Malaika lifted her gaze to the doctor. "I would like to know every medicine he is receiving." Chikole smiled without warmth. "That is not a burden I would place on you. It is already on me." The younger physician at the foot of the bed looked up briefly, then quickly looked away. Fear. Uncertainty, maybe both. Malaika stored that too. Chikole folded the chart closed. "Mr. Oki's condition is medically complex. Emotional attachment can make families suspicious of necessary care." "I am not suspicious because I am emotional," Malaika said softly. "I am suspicious because each time your medicines touch him, he gets worse." One of the nurses went still, only for a heartbeat. But Chikole noticed it too. His face hardened by a fraction before returning to calm. "You are exhausted, Mrs. Okoye. It would be best not to repeat dangerous accusations." "I asked a question," she said. "I did not make a speech." The doctor stepped closer, lowering his voice so the others would hear intimacy instead of threat. "Then hear my answer clearly. Your husband is dying. That is not murder. That is reality." Malaika held his gaze. For one dangerous second, neither looked away. Then footsteps approached from the corridor, and Madame Ifeyinwa entered with Jelani at her side. Perfect timing. Too perfect. Ifeyinwa came straight to the bed, the image of controlled grief. Her hand hovered above Tendaji's forehead, but did not quite touch him. "My poor son," she whispered. Always another setback. Jelani glanced at the chart. "Will he last the week?" The question came too quickly, too naturally. Chikole gave the sort of sigh doctors perfected when grief had to be managed gently. "I cannot promise anything." Ifeyinwa turned to Malaika. "You see, this is why I begged you not to exhaust yourself with fantasies. Hope can become cruelty when the body has already surrendered." Malaika looked from one face to the next. The doctor, the stepmother, the cousin. They spoke around Tendaji like heirs around a coffin. They had been rehearsing this ending for months. Then, with sudden clarity, she understood the point of this performance. They wanted witnesses, not medical witnesses, narrative witnesses. A new wife, a devoted mother, a sorrowful cousin, a respected doctor. Enough people in the room to say later that everything had been done, everything had been proper, and death had arrived naturally while love watched helplessly. They were not just planning his death, they were preparing its paperwork. Malaika stepped back half a pace and lowered her eyes, letting silence settle over her face like surrender. "Then I will pray." Ifeyinwa's shoulders loosened almost invisibly. Jelani lost interest at once. Chikole nodded. "That would be wise." "Yes," Malaika thought. "Let them believe wisdom looks like obedience." By noon, the extra staff had left. Only one nurse remained outside the room. Chikele had gone downstairs for a scheduled family consultation. Ifeyinwa had retreated to take calls. Jelani was at the company offices, or so the servant said. The house relaxed in the dangerous way. Powerful houses relaxed never fully, but enough to expose the seams between watched moments. Sade found Malaika in the corridor near the linen room. "There are 10 minutes," she whispered. "For what? For truth. Come now." She did not wait for agreement. Malaika followed her down a back staircase. Servants used to avoid the main halls. The air changed as they descended, cooler, dustier, less perfumed. The elegance of the mansion grew thinner the farther one moved from the rooms meant to impress guests. At the end of a narrow passage, Sade unlocked a storage room stacked with boxed glassware, old drapes, and disused furniture. Only when the door closed did she turn fully toward Malaika. "You should have burned that note," Sade said. "You wrote it." Sade did not answer at once. Her silence confirmed it. "Why help me?" Malaika asked. For a moment, Sade seemed older than she looked upstairs. Tired in the bone, not just the face. "Because I once failed someone else." Malaika waited. Sade pressed her lips together, then spoke in a low, steady voice. "I served Madame Abeni, Tendaji's mother. She was not soft, but she was fair. She learned names. She noticed missing wages. She noticed bruises. In houses like this that already makes a woman dangerous." Malaika felt her breath catch. "You think she was killed?" "I think she knew too much and became inconvenient." Sade's eyes darkened. At first it was small things. Drinks she had not requested. Sudden weakness. Confusion. Falls. Then whispers, stress, exhaustion, nerves. By the time she understood what was happening, everyone around her had already agreed on a different story. The room seemed to draw inward. "And you said nothing." "I tried." The words came out raw. "I told a senior steward the medicines were wrong. He told Madame Ifeyinwa. 2 days later I was accused of theft and beaten before the staff to teach the others what happens to servants who imagine themselves important." She touched the scar near her temple. "After that I learned silence." Malaika looked at the mark with new understanding, but not complete silence. She said, "No." Sade met her gaze. "Not this time." A long stillness passed between them. Then Sade reached into her apron and pulled out a small key ring tied with blue thread. From it she removed one thin brass key and placed it in Malaika's palm. "What is this?" "The archive room in the West Hall, officially locked because of renovations, unofficially used to store old corporate records, legal copies, household ledgers. Madame Abeni used to keep duplicates of everything there before some were moved. After her death, most people stopped bothering with the room. Sade's eyes flicked toward the door. "Jelani still goes there sometimes. At night." Malaika closed her fingers around the key. "I cannot promise what remains," Sade said. "But if Tendaji told you there are papers, you may find more than one set." Malaika's pulse quickened. "He did tell me something. About a will." Sade inhaled sharply. "Then listen carefully. If there is a revised will, they will either try to destroy it or prove he signed it while incompetent. That has always been the game. Not just to kill him." She stopped herself and corrected with bitter precision. "To make his death legally useful." That sentence landed with brutal force. Legally useful. Yes, that was the true shape of the conspiracy. Not rage, not impulsive hatred. Administration, carefully managed theft disguised as fate. "What do you know about the board?" Malaika asked. Sade gave a humorless smile. "Only what servants hear while pretending not to exist." After Tendaji collapsed, Jelani stepped in as acting operations head. Temporary, they said. Always temporary. Then temporary became normal. 3 board members owe him favors. 1 owes Ifeyinwa. 1 is afraid of scandal. One old man still supported Tendaji, but he stopped visiting after the second hospitalization. Do you know his name, Mr. Afolayan? She frowned, searching memory. Bald, quiet, loyal to Madame Abeni once, I think. Malaika repeated the name, softly fixing it in place. Sade took one step closer. There is more. Your father came back after the chapel. Malaika stiffened. For what? He met privately with Ifeyinwa for 20 minutes in the blue sitting room. No servants were allowed inside. A sick chill went through her. They are discussing me, or the price of your obedience? Sade said. That hurt because it sounded likely. Malaika turned away and paced once through the narrow room. Her mind moved quickly now, linking what had seemed separate. Her father's certainty, Ifeyinwa's false comfort, Jelani's impatience, Chikale's timing, the staged vigil at the bedside, the whispered talk of honor and care and terminal decline. It was all one machine, and she had been placed inside it as the final decorative piece. A poor bride with no allies, a legal wife who would inherit sympathy but not control, a witness who could be guided, discredited, or purchased, unless she stopped playing the role they had written for her. She turned back to Sade. I need access to Tendaji alone tonight. You'll have it for a short time after the evening rounds. I also need the medication schedule before Chikele can change it. Saad nodded. The nurse on second watch copies everything into the desk drawer at 7. She is frightened, not loyal. Fear can be useful if touched gently. Malaika absorbed that too. Sade hesitated, then asked the question that mattered most. Do you trust Tendaji? Malaika thought of the night storm, the hidden folder, the way his voice had weakened, but not broken when he named the plan for what it was. She thought of how easily powerful men lied, but also how rarely dying men wasted strength pretending to the only person trying to save them. Yes, she said. Then move quickly, Sade replied. Because once they realize he is improving even slightly, this house will become more dangerous than it was for his mother. The warning settled hard. More dangerous. Malaika slipped the brass key into her sleeve. When she returned upstairs, the mansion looked the same as it had that morning. Marble flowers, servants, silence. But now its beauty felt thinner, more fragile. She could see the machinery beneath it, the greed, the paper trails, the hands that signed suffering into legality, and then called it order. She paused outside Tendaji's door and glanced once down the corridor, where portraits of the Okoye family gleamed in the afternoon light. Generations of carefully arranged faces, power framed in gold, respectability hung on walls. None of it meant innocence. Inside her sleeve, the archive key pressed against her skin like a promise. Tonight she would search for the hidden records. Tonight she would learn what version of Tendaji's future they had tried to write without him. And if the revised will truly existed, then this mansion was no longer just a place where a man was being poisoned. It was a battlefield built out of signatures. By the time the invitation arrived, it was already a threat. The cream-colored card was delivered to Malaika's room on a silver tray just before sunset, embossed with gold lettering and the Okoye family crest. It announced a private evening reception at the mansion, an intimate gathering of investors, charity patrons, selected board members, and family friends. A statement of continuity, it called it. A graceful opportunity to thank those who had stood beside the family during Tendaji Okoye's tragic decline. Tragic decline! The words looked elegant on paper. They smelled like burial cloth. Malaika stood by the window with the card in her hand while the sky outside turned from amber to blue. Below, luxury cars were already beginning to arrive through the front gates. Men in black suits moved through the courtyard with earpieces and polished shoes. Staff carried floral arrangements into the reception hall. Crystal was being placed, candles lit, music tested. Grief in houses like this was always better when catered. A knock came. Sade entered, carrying a garment bag. "Madame Ifeyinwa says this is for you." Malaika unzipped it and found a deep, wine-colored gown, elegant enough to flatter, but restrained enough to appear respectful. Rich fabric, modest neckline, no freedom hidden anywhere in its beauty. "She wants me displayed," Malaika said. Sade's expression remained unreadable. "Yes." "Where is Tendaji? Dr. Chikele completed the evening round early." Sade lowered her voice. "He increased one medication." Malaika's chest tightened. Without me there, Sade nodded once, but Tendaji anticipated it. He did not swallow all of it. Relief came sharp and brief. Then anger replaced it. "Why this party now?" Malaika asked. "Because tonight they want witnesses," Sade said. "Not to his death, to his replacement." The truth of it landed immediately. Of course. A public room, a respectable gathering. A grieving household. Jelani stepping naturally into visibility, while the legal wife appeared subdued, overwhelmed, and harmless. They were not merely consoling allies, they were managing transition. Malaika zipped the dress bag closed. Sade did not move. "There is more." Malaika looked up. "The second watch nurse told me someone from security was instructed to keep a particular camera angle active near the east corridor, and one of the footmen heard Jelani asking whether the wife drinks wine." A cold understanding slid into place. "They're setting something up." "Yes." "What kind?" Sade hesitated. "The kind that destroys a woman faster than poison destroys a man." For a moment the room was very still. Malaika thought of her father's warning to remain obedient. Zainabu's contempt. Ifeyinwa's measured softness. In families like these there were many ways to erase inconvenient people. Men were removed through law, finance, or medicine. Women were removed through shame. "Who is the man?" Malaika asked quietly. Sade blinked. "What if they want scandal? They need a man to hang it on." "A servant." "A guest security," Sade understood at once. "Possibly one of the drivers. Or a guard from the west gate. Someone disposable but believable." Malaika crossed to the mirror and looked at herself in the fading light. Not at her face, but at the role others kept trying to fit around it. Poor girl. Obedient bride, useful widow, now perhaps unfaithful opportunist. Every lie had the same purpose: make sure no one listened when she spoke. She turned back. "Then tonight they won't just see me." Sade's eyes sharpened. "What are you planning?" "Not improvisation," Malaika said. "Evidence." An hour later, the reception hall glittered like a palace built for denial. The ceiling rose high above polished marble columns wrapped in white orchids. A string quartet played softly from one corner. Waiters moved through the crowd with champagne. Men in tailored suits spoke in low voices about markets, succession, and prayer, as if those three things belonged together. Women in silk and diamonds lowered their voices whenever they looked toward Malaika, which only made their curiosity louder. She entered exactly when she was expected to, not late enough to offend, not early enough to control the room. The wine-colored dress fit perfectly. Another calculation, another reminder that someone in this house liked measuring her without asking. Every head turned just briefly. Then the whispers began. "There she is, the village bride. Poor thing. How young she looks. Do you think he'll survive the month? Will she inherit anything?" Malaika heard all of it without appearing to hear any of it. She moved through the room with quiet restraint, accepting condolences she had not requested, nodding to strangers who looked at her as if she were already half a widow. Across the hall, Ifeyinwa stood beneath a chandelier greeting guests with composed sorrow. She wore ivory tonight, not black. Grief softened her image. Wealth completed it. Jelani, meanwhile, was everywhere, not visibly hosting. That would have seemed ambitious. Instead, he drifted from cluster to cluster, speaking just enough, smiling, just enough stepping into empty conversational spaces like water finding cracks in stone. By the time an hour had passed, he already looked like a man the room was getting used to. Temporary becomes normal, Sade had said. Yes, this was how. A board member with a silver beard introduced himself to Malaika as Mr. Afolayan. She kept her breath steady. So this was the loyal one. He bowed slightly. Mrs. Okoye, I had hoped to pay my respects earlier. They said you were resting. They. Always they. Thank you, she said. My husband spoke highly of those who stayed honest near him. Something flickered in the older man's eyes. Not surprised that Tendaji had spoken. Surprised that Malaika knew honesty was a rarity here. He lowered his voice. Your husband was a difficult man to deceive. Was. Not is. Yet the sentence carried something else too, memory, perhaps loyalty, not fully dead. Malaika met his gaze. Some people are still trying. Before he could answer, Ifeyinwa appeared beside them with impeccable timing. Mr. Afolayan, she said warmly, always so kind. Malaika dear, the guests are asking after you. Come greet the foundation donors. Malaika smiled faintly. Of course. As she moved away, Afolayan did not speak again, but his expression had changed. He was watching now. Good. Let him watch. Let more than one pair of honest eyes remain open tonight. Halfway through the reception, a waiter offered Malaika champagne. She declined. A second brought sparkling water. She accepted but did not drink. A third appeared with red wine and said, Madame Ifeyinwa insisted. That one she took, not because she wanted it, because it had arrived too deliberately. She carried the glass without lifting it to her lips. Minutes later, the first pull came. A young man in a dark suit approached with the deferential confidence of household staff trained to become invisible. He was handsome enough to make gossip plausible, forgettable enough to be sacrificed if needed. Madam, he said quietly, there is a message from the doctor regarding your husband. He asked me to escort you to the East Gallery. It's private. Malaika let just enough alarm touch her face. Is he worse? I was told it is urgent. Of course. She followed. Not quickly, not reluctantly, just like a worried wife who still believed the house might speak plainly for once. The East Gallery was dimmer than the main hall, lined with framed photographs and antique mirrors. Music from the reception drifted in faintly from the far doors. No doctor waited there, only the young man. He stopped near a recessed alcove, partly hidden by velvet drapes. A camera dome was visible in the corner, angled with suspicious precision. Malaika did not turn toward it. Instead, she looked at him directly. What is your name? He faltered. Madam, your name? Kojo. He looked suddenly less confident. Younger. Nervous. Malaika stepped no closer. Kojo, who told you to bring me here? His throat moved. No answer. I'm going to help you, she said softly. Because if this goes the way they planned it, people like them will still have a future tomorrow. People like you won't. His eyes flicked toward the camera. There. Not loyalty. Fear. I was only told he began, then stopped. Told what? That if you seemed emotional, I should comfort you. His voice dropped lower. Then others would come. Others. Witnesses. A grieving wife alone with a man in private. A hand on her waist. A moment framed correctly, enough to imply impropriety, enough to stain, enough to question her rights if inheritance became contested. Malaika kept her voice calm. Who would come? He swallowed. Mr. Jelani, one of the senior stewards. Maybe Madame Aifeyinwa. I don't know. Good. Not certainty. Conspiracy. The difference mattered. Listen carefully, Malaika said. In the next minute, you will decide whether you are a tool or a witness. Before he could answer, footsteps sounded from the far end of the gallery. Too soon. They were coming. Malaika moved instantly, not toward him, but away, backing into clear view of the camera with the untouched wine glass in one hand. Jelani rounded the corner first, followed by a steward, and two female guests wearing expressions already sharpened for scandal. Perfect. Exactly what they wanted. Except Malaika spoke first. Her voice cut cleanly through the corridor. Then say it again, Kojo. Say clearly that you told me Madame Ifeyinwa sent you here with a false message about my husband. Everything stopped. Jelani's face changed. Only slightly. But enough. Kojo went pale. The steward froze. One of the women gasped. No, madame, Kojo stammered. Malaika lifted the untouched wine glass. And shall I also tell them this was the third drink offered to me tonight after I refused the first two? Or shall we all pretend this corridor, that camera, and your sudden concern for my comfort are wholly accidents? The silence turned violent. Jelani recovered first, smiling with poisonous ease. You misunderstand. We were worried for you. Malaika looked at him as if he had bored her. Then you should worry more carefully. The older female guest glanced from Kojo to the camera to Jelani, and the room began doing the thing conspirators hated most. It began thinking. Jelani took one step forward. You're upset? No, Malaika said. I'm observant. She turned then, not to flee, but to walk back toward the reception hall at an unhurried pace, carrying the wine glass like evidence. Let them follow. Let them choose between scene and silence. Let them feel uncertainty spreading under their perfect arrangements. They followed. Of course they did. The hall had not yet settled when Malaika stepped beneath the full chandelier light and set the untouched wine glass down on the nearest silver tray with a clear, deliberate click. Then she raised her voice just enough for the nearest circle of guests to hear. My apologies, she said. There was some confusion in the East Gallery. A false medical message was used to draw me away from the reception. Fortunately, the misunderstanding was discovered before anyone embarrassed themselves. The sentence was elegant, mercilessly elegant. Heads turned everywhere, conversations died mid-breath. Jelani arrived half a beat too late to control the story. Aifeyinwa crossed the room at once, her face arranged into concern so swift it almost deserved applause. Malaika, dear, what happened? Malaika faced her. Not frightened, not meek, not loud, just clear. A servant claimed there was an urgent message about my husband from the doctor. There was no doctor. She let the word settle. Perhaps in a house this large, instructions become distorted on their way down. Ifeyinwa's eyes flicked once toward Kojo. Tiny, cold, deadly. Kojo saw it too. Malaika knew he did because terror rolled off him like heat. Then, unexpectedly, another voice entered the silence. Mr. Afolayan. In matters involving a terminal patient, the older man said from across the room, there should be no distortions at all. The words were calm, but they landed like a hammer. Ifeyinwa smiled, but the edges of it had gone thin. Of course, we all agree. Do we, Malaika thought. Good. Let the question live. The room resumed its breathing, but not its comfort. Something had been damaged tonight, even if only subtly. Not the conspiracy itself. Not yet. Its smoothness, its assumption that she could be moved like furniture. Later, as the quartet played on and the guests returned to their drinks with sharpened curiosity, Sade slipped behind Malaika near the service entrance. Without looking at her, she whispered, The nurse's copy of the medication schedule is in the writing desk drawer, and Kojo is shaking badly enough to talk. Malaika kept her face still. Then tonight she murmured, "We begin pulling threads," because the trap had failed. And when traps failed, frightened people made mistakes. Somewhere upstairs Tendaji was still alive. Somewhere in the house records were still hidden. And now somewhere in the fear spreading under silk and chandeliers, the first crack had appeared. The mansion did not sleep after the reception. It merely changed masks. Long after the last donor had left and the final luxury car disappeared through the gates, the Okoye house still breathed with hidden motion. Servants cleared crystal in silence. Security rotated positions. Lights in the west wing remained on much later than they should have. Somewhere doors opened softly and closed softer. The party had ended, but the calculations it had served were still moving through the walls. From her room, Malaika waited. She had changed out of the wine-colored dress and into a plain, dark wrapper that made it easier to move quietly. The brass archive key Sade had given her lay tucked inside her sleeve. In the small mirror by the wardrobe, her reflection looked less like a bride and more like a woman preparing to enter enemy territory. A soft tap came at the door. 3 short knocks. Sade's signal. Malaika opened it immediately. "The corridor is clear for now," Sade whispered. "Second watch has changed. Kojo was sent off the floor. Punished, not yet. Watched." Said glanced down the hall before continuing. "He wants to speak. But not here." Later, Malaika said. "First, the archive." Sade gave one quick nod. Dr. Chikele finished the evening review. He left a revised dosage sheet in the writing desk, just as expected. I copied the times. She slipped a folded paper into Malaika's hand. And Tendaji is awake in intervals. Weak but clear. Relief passed across Malaika's body so quickly it almost staggered her. She unfolded the paper and scanned it under the lamp. The schedule had indeed changed. 2 doses moved closer together. 1 sedative increased. A new injectable added as needed for distress. As needed. The phrase made her jaw tighten. No, not distress. Convenience. Someone wanted Tendaji less lucid, less recoverable, less able to become a problem. Malaika folded the note again. "If I'm not back in 20 minutes, Saad cut her off. "Then I burn the copy, move the folder from your room, and deny I ever saw you." Malaika looked at her. Sade held her gaze without apology. "We survive first." A breath of hard understanding passed between them. "Yes," Malaika said. "We do." They moved separately through the mansion. Sade took the servants' stairs. Malaika used the main corridor because sometimes the safest disguise in rich houses was looking as if one belonged exactly where one was going. The West Hall was darker than the ceremonial rooms, lined with portraits of dead men who had built their names from trade politics and well-dressed violence. At the far end stood a carved teak door with a brass plate that read, "Archival Storage, closed for inventory." Closed for inventory. A lie respectable enough to survive years. Malaika listened. Nothing. She slipped the brass key into the lock. For one terrifying second, it resisted. Then it turned. Inside, the air smelled of dust paper and long secrecy. Shelves lined the room from floor to ceiling, stacked with household ledgers, old contracts, legal boxes framed minutes from board meetings, and binders marked with years in gold ink. A green banker's lamp glowed weakly on the central table, left on by someone who expected to return. That meant one thing. Jelani had been here recently. Malaika shut the door behind her and moved quickly. She began where men like him would begin recent records. Board resolutions, medical expense files, legal correspondence from the past year. She scanned labels, hands moving faster with each empty folder, each irrelevant memo, each stack of sanitized paperwork meant to create an official story. Budget adjustments, charitable transfers, authority delegation letters, temporary governance frameworks, All clean. Too clean. Then she noticed one shelf with a broken sequence. Then a gap. Then 2022. Missing years were rarely innocent. Malaika reached behind the row and felt wood where there should have been wall. A second layer. A hidden partition. Her pulse jumped. She pressed along the back panel until something clicked, and a narrow compartment sprang loose. Inside were 3 flat document wallets and a leather notebook cracked with age. She took all of them to the table. The first wallet contained household ledgers from the year Madame Abeni died. At first glance, they looked ordinary staff wages, vehicle repairs, floral accounts, private travel. Then Malaika saw the repeated entries under special care procurement. Unusually frequent, unusually expensive. Paid to a medical supplier whose name had been partly crossed out and rewritten twice. The second wallet held correspondence. Not copies of formal letters, personal memos, one from Abeni Okoye to a corporate attorney. If anything happens to me, suddenly review the procurement chain tied to home care. I do not trust the replacement specialist Madame Ifeyinwa recommended. Malaika's breath caught. Another memo, unsigned but clearly written in a different hand, read, Madam collapsed again after tonic. Doctor says nerves. She says bitterness in the mouth before dizziness. Bitterness. The same word her own mind had reached for. The third wallet shook in her hands before she even opened it. Inside lay partial copies of a revised will and 2 witness statements. The final signature page was missing, but the intent was clear enough to send cold through her entire body. If Tendaji died while declared mentally or physically incompetent, temporary executive power would default to a controlled board structure, pending estate review. But if he recovered and reaffirmed the revision, a separate trust would activate one that removed discretionary family control over large holdings and protected certain internal investigations from being buried. He had known. Not everything, perhaps, but enough. Enough to prepare for betrayal. Malaika reached for the leather notebook last. It was Abeni's. Not a diary in the sentimental sense, a battlefield ledger. Dates, impressions, names, transactions, private observations. A mother's intelligence archive disguised as household reflection. Page after page revealed a woman who had understood the world she lived in and refused to be naive inside it. Jelani too eager around board men, watches Tendaji like a substitute son practicing a role. Ifeyinwa smiles most when she is lying. I should never have permitted her to manage the health retreats. Moses Kalu's mother worked in my first Lagos house. Honest woman. Said her granddaughter has clear eyes. Strange that I thought of that child today. Malaika went still. Her grandmother, not just a servant in the household. Known. Remembered. Her fingers trembled as she turned the page. If anything happens to me, and if Tendaji is ever alone among wolves, perhaps old loyalties may still matter. For a moment, the room disappeared. Malaika could almost see it, the threads stretching backward through years neither family had spoken aloud. Her grandmother serving Abeni. Abeni noticing things others dismissed. A child once mentioned in passing. Old loyalties surviving under new names. She had been told all her life that she came from nowhere important. But the notebook suggested something else. Not noble blood. Not destiny. Something more powerful. Memory. Someone had remembered her family's honesty long after the rich forgot the poor existed, except when needed. A floorboard creaked outside. Malaika snapped the notebook shut and blew out the banker's lamp at once. Darkness swallowed the room. She stood motionless, every muscle tight, listening. Footsteps. One person. Approaching slowly. Then stopping just outside the archive door. Her heartbeat slammed against her ribs. The latch moved once. Not enough to open, just enough to test whether it had been locked. Malaika held her breath so hard it hurt. After 3 endless seconds, the footsteps retreated. She waited 10 more before moving again. Too close. Far too close. She shoved the will copies and Abeni's notebook beneath her shawl. The household ledgers and correspondence she returned to the hidden compartment exactly as she had found them, not because they mattered less, but because missing evidence would trigger alarm. Partial truth unnoticed was more valuable than complete truth discovered gone. When she slipped back into the corridor, it was empty. She locked the archive room and walked, not ran, toward the service staircase. The instinct to flee almost overwhelmed her, but panic drew more eyes than calm. Rich houses noticed disorder more than suffering. At the turn near the blue sitting room, she saw light under the door. Voices inside. One was Ifeinwa's, the other belonged to a man she knew too well, Moses Kalu. Malaika stopped in the shadow of a column. The door was not fully shut, only slightly ajar. She moved closer until the words became clear. She is becoming difficult. Ifeinwa was saying, her tone stripped of softness now. That was not our understanding. Moses sounded strained. She was always quiet. I do not know what changed. You should, Ifeinwa replied. She is your daughter. Daughter. The way she said it carried no respect at all. Only blame for a defective product. Moses lowered his voice, but Malaika still heard every word. You promised the marriage itself would settle everything. Once the boy died, she would receive a stipend and leave quietly. The boy. Not Tendaji. Not son-in-law. Not even man. The boy. As if death made powerful men children again, and greed made older men bold. Ifeinwa's answer came like silk over a knife. Plans require cooperation. Your daughter seems to be forgetting what was arranged. Arranged. There it was again. Not merely assumed. Arranged. Malaika's stomach turned. Moses said, Then increase the pressure. Remind her what family can suffer when one member grows proud. A wave of cold passed through her, so intense she almost lost balance. He was not pleading for her safety. He was advising her control. Zainabu's voice entered suddenly from farther inside the room. Or perhaps it is simpler than that. If she is discredited, no one will care what she says. Malaika closed her eyes once. Just once. Then opened them harder. Now she knew. Not suspicion. Not fear. Not instinct. Knowledge. Her father, her half-sister, and Ifeinwa had all discussed her role after the marriage. They had expected obedience, widowhood, and silence. Her life had already been budgeted into the future like an afterthought. She stepped away from the door before rage made her reckless. At the bottom of the servants' stairs, Sade waited in the shadows. One look at Malaika's face, and she understood something major had shifted. You found something? Yes, Malaika said. More than one thing. Sade guided her quickly into an unused laundry room and shut the door. Malaika laid the notebook and copied will pages on the table. Sade stared at Abeni's handwriting and covered her mouth with one hand. She kept them, she whispered. After all these years. She also remembered my grandmother, Malaika said. Sade looked up sharply. Malaika nodded. This was not random. Not entirely. Abeni knew of my family before all this. Sade ran her fingers over the edge of the notebook with reverence, as if touching a ghost who had finally returned to testify. Then she saw the copied will pages, and her expression changed again. Tendaji must see this tonight. He will. Malaika took a steadying breath. And there is more. I heard Ifeinwa with my father. They had terms. They expected me to go silent after Tendaji died. Zainabu is in it too. Sade's face hardened in a way Malaika had not seen before. No more doubts, then? No. Outside, somewhere deep in the mansion, a clock struck 1. Malaika gathered the papers back beneath her shawl. What had begun as a marriage trap was no longer just about Tendaji's poisoning or the company's succession. It was bigger now, older, rooted in Abeni's death. and in a network of respectable betrayals that stretched from boardroom to chapel to family home, she had entered the Okoye mansion as the disposable bride of a dying man. But tonight, in a locked archive room, the dead had reached forward and placed a weapon in her hands. A notebook, a partial will, a chain of memory. And for the first time since the wedding, Malaika felt something stronger than fear rise inside her. Not hope. Resolve. Because Madame Abini had been buried under lies. Tendaji was being buried alive, and if no one stopped it, the same machine would bury Malaika next. Before dawn, Tendaji stood for the first time. Not for long, not steadily, and not without pain that turned his face white and his breathing ragged. But he stood. Malaika had locked the door to his room from the inside, while Sade kept watch in the corridor with a tray of folded linens ready to become invisible if footsteps approached. The curtains were still drawn. The monitors were muted as much as possible. The room smelled of medicine, rain-damp stone, and the bitter herbs Malaika had begun secretly mixing into his water to help flush the sedatives from his system. Tendaji's hand gripped the carved bedpost so tightly the tendons stood out beneath his skin. His bare feet trembled against the carpet. Sweat darkened the collar of his nightshirt. But he was upright, jaw clenched, eyes burning with the humiliation and determination of a man refusing to remain a body on display. Malaika stood close enough to catch him if he fell. "You don't have to prove anything this minute," she whispered. "I do," he said through his teeth. "To myself first." His knees shook. For one frightening moment she thought he would collapse. Then he took a single step. It was ugly, slow, nothing like the easy stride of the man in the portraits downstairs. But it was real. Malaika's breath caught. Tendaji took another step, then another, until the effort broke through the thin control he had kept over his face. He swore under his breath, swayed, and would have hit the floor if she had not caught his arm and turned her shoulder under his weight. They sank together onto the edge of the bed. He laughed once, a rough, exhausted sound full of disbelief and fury. If Jelani could see me now, he'd either faint or order another dosage. Malaika couldn't help it. She laughed too quietly, breathlessly, almost startled by the sound of it in a room that had held so much fear. The moment passed quickly, but something warm remained after it. Not softness, not safety. Something rarer. Shared survival. Tendaji leaned back against the headboard while she offered him water. He drank slowly, then looked at the documents spread between them, Abeni's notebook, the partial will, and the medication schedule Sade had copied. He had gone very still when Malaika first showed him his mother's handwriting. Now he touched the cover of the notebook with 2 fingers, almost reverently. She kept records of everything he said softly, even when people mocked her for it. She was right to. Yes, his face hardened. And they killed her for being right. The sentence settled in the room like a verdict already written. Malaika sat beside him, watching his expression change as he read. Grief moved through him, but it was not the helpless grief of a son learning something new. It was deeper than that. Recognition. Confirmation. The terrible relief of seeing nightmare become evidence. When he finished the page about the replacement specialist and the bitter taste before collapse, he closed the notebook very carefully. "My mother knew," he said. "Maybe not every name, but enough." And she tried to leave a trail. Malaika looked at him. She did leave one. He met her gaze. For a second the room seemed to hold only the 2 of them and the dead woman whose voice had reached across years to warn them. Then a soft knock sounded. 3 short taps. Sade. Malaika opened the door just enough. Sade's face was tight. "There's a problem." That sentence had become too common in the mansion. "What happened?" Malaika asked. Sade glanced once toward Tendaji, saw him sitting upright, and despite the urgency, shock flashed through her face. She recovered quickly. "Kojo has spoken." Tendaji straightened. To whom? To me first, Sade said, and now perhaps to too many others. He says Jelani promised him money and a transfer to a better post if he followed instructions during the reception. But after the scene in the gallery, security took him downstairs. He heard them say he may be dismissed for misconduct. Malaika understood instantly. So now he's frightened enough to bargain. Yes, but not only that. Saad lowered her voice further. He says the West storage cameras were reviewed after midnight. Someone realized the archive door was opened. A sharp silence followed. Tendaji's eyes darkened. How much does Jelani know? Not what was taken, Sade said. Not yet. But he knows someone entered, which meant the house would tighten now. Access would shrink. Surveillance would increase. Smiles would become thinner. Mistakes would become costlier. Tendaji swung his legs off the bed too fast. Pain crossed his face, but he pushed through it. Then we accelerate. Malaika turned toward him. You can barely stand. I don't need to run a marathon. I need to move before they decide to stop pretending. He looked at Sade. What about the board? Sade answered at once. 2 members are visiting this afternoon for a private family briefing. A 3rd arrives tomorrow. If Jelani senses instability, he may push for an emergency declaration of incapacity. Tendaji gave one grim nod. Exactly. Malaika stepped closer. Then what's the plan? His eyes shifted to the partial will, then to Abini's notebook, then back to her. We need 3 things at once. More evidence, 1 board member willing to listen before Jelani seals the room, and a public mistake from our enemies that cannot be buried. Malaika absorbed that. Kojo. Yes, Tendaji said. If he talks properly, he gives us the beginning of a pattern. And the rest? Tendaji's mouth flattened. The rest depends on how far Jelani is willing to go. By noon, they had their answer. Very far. Malaika was crossing the upper hallway with a tray in her hands. One more performance, one more careful disguise when raised voices drifted from the servants' courtyard below. She stopped at the rail and looked down through the carved balusters. 2 security men were holding an older groundskeeper by the arms. He was a thin man with grey at his temples and soil still clinging to his sleeves dragged straight from the gardens. Beside him stood another servant on her knees, crying openly, hands clasped so tightly in front of her chest they shook. Sade's friend Malaika realized, the one whose father Jelani had targeted before. Jelani himself stood in the courtyard in a light suit, speaking in the maddeningly calm tone cruel men used when they wanted violence to look like policy. Theft of internal records is not a misunderstanding, he was saying. It is sabotage. The old groundskeeper looked confused and terrified. Sir, I don't know anything about records. No, Jelani asked mildly. Then perhaps your daughter can explain why she was seen speaking privately with restricted staff. The young maid sobbed harder. Please, sir, I only asked Sade for headache herbs. That is all. Malaika's grip tightened on the tray. This was not investigation. It was theater, a message. Jelani could not yet name the hand that had entered the archive, so he was doing what men like him always did, hurting the weak, until the truth shook loose from someone's fear. Below one guard twisted the old man's arm higher. He cried out. Malaika started down the stairs before she had fully decided to. By the time she entered the courtyard, 6 servants had gathered at the edges, pretending to work while watching everything. Fear hung in the air like heat. Jelani turned, irritation flashing the moment he saw her. This is a private disciplinary matter. No, Malaika said. It is a public cruelty being done in a private voice. The guards froze, uncertain. Jelani smiled without kindness. You are becoming fond of dramatic sentences, and you are becoming careless with witnesses. That made him glance briefly toward the surrounding staff. Good. Let him remember eyes existed outside his own. The old groundskeeper sagged in the guard's grip, face twisted in pain. Malaika stepped closer, setting the tray down deliberately on a stone bench. What was he accused of? Jelani folded his arms. Information theft. By evidence or convenience? His expression cooled. Mrs. Okoye, return upstairs. She did not move. From the corner of her vision, she saw Saad appear near the service door, carrying a basket of towels, as if she had simply wandered into the scene by chance. Their eyes met for the briefest instant. Hold that glance, said. Hold the room. Malaika looked back at Jelani. If you have proof, call the police. If you do not, release him. The silence that followed was dangerous because it was so thin. Jelani took one step toward her. You forget yourself. No, she said quietly. You keep hoping I will. Around them, the servants were no longer pretending not to watch. That changed everything. Cruelty liked shadows. It disliked audiences that might remember. Jelani saw it too. His smile reappeared brittle this time. He lifted one hand and the guards released the old man with visible reluctance. Very well, he said. Perhaps I was too swift. Let no one say this house lacks mercy. Mercy. The word nearly made Malaika sick. The old groundskeeper stumbled toward his daughter. She caught him weeping. The staff lowered their eyes at once, each of them understanding the lesson. Not safety, only postponement. Jelani stepped close enough that only Malaika heard his next words. You are protected by timing, not strength. Malaika held his gaze. Then you should fear what happens when timing changes. Something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. Then he turned and walked away. Said joined Malaika moments later under the pretense of retrieving the tray. Her voice was almost inaudible. That was reckless. Yes. It was also useful. Sade kept her head bowed. Every servant in this courtyard will repeat what happened before nightfall. Malaika exhaled slowly. Good. But usefulness had a price. By evening, the house felt different, tighter. Doors that had once stood open were closed. 2 new cameras appeared in the east corridor. Dr. Chikele arrived earlier than usual and stayed longer. Ifeyinwa sent 3 separate messages asking after Malaika's health, in a tone so sweet it might as well have been venom dissolved in tea. And then, just before sunset, the final blow of the day landed. A package arrived from her family home. No sender's card, only her name. Inside was a folded headscarf she recognized immediately. It had belonged to her late mother. Wrapped inside it was a note in Moses Kalu's hand. A daughter's pride can destroy an entire family. Think carefully before you force us all to suffer. Malaika stared at the words until her vision blurred for one hot, furious second. There it was, no apology, no remorse. A threat. He was using her dead mother's scarf to carry it. Tendaji found her minutes later sitting on the edge of the chair by the window, the scarf in her lap, her face gone, very still. He looked from the scarf to the note and understood enough. From your father? She nodded. Tendaji took the paper, read it once, and his jaw tightened so hard a muscle jumped near his temple. He's trying to use blood as a weapon, he said. He always has. Tendaji looked at her, then, not with pity, which she would have hated, but with a depth of anger so controlled it felt like respect. Then we stop letting them choose the battlefield. Outside, the sky darkened over the city. Inside, servants whispered, board members moved closer, and enemies adjusted plans around cracks they had not expected to appear. Tendaji could stand now. Malaika could no longer be easily shamed. And after the courtyard scene, the house itself had started to watch its masters more carefully. The war had changed shape. No longer hidden entirely in medicines and paperwork. Now it lived in glances, rumors, threats, and frightened loyalties shifting under pressure. And Malaika understood with chilling certainty that Jelani and Ifeyinwa would not wait much longer. If they could not keep Tendaji weak forever, they would have to strike before he became visible. The emergency board meeting was announced at 8:10 the next morning, not by letter, not by formal schedule, by panic dressed as procedure. Said brought the news first, breathless but controlled, slipping into Malaika's room just after sunrise with a tray of untouched tea to preserve appearances. They moved it forward, she said. 11 o'clock, main conference hall. Jelani is telling everyone there are urgent legal concerns about Mr. Okoye's mental capacity and the stability of the company. Malaika was already standing. Of course he was. The archive had been disturbed. The servants were whispering. Kojo had become a risk. The courtyard incident had weakened Jelani's image of quiet authority, and most dangerous of all, Tendaji was no longer entirely trapped inside a bed. Their enemies had felt the room shifting beneath them, so now they were moving to pour concrete over the truth before it fully rose. "Who's coming?" Malaika asked. Sade set the tray down. Jelani. Madam Ifeyinwa. Dr. Chikele. At least 4 board members. 2 legal advisors. Mr. Afolayan confirmed at dawn. Good, Malaika thought. Let him be there. And Kojo, she asked. Sade's expression hardened. Locked in staff quarters overnight, but he passed a message through the laundry boy. He says he wants protection in exchange for testimony. Tendaji, seated in the armchair near the window, looked up from Abeni's notebook. He was dressed for the first time in dark trousers and a plain white shirt beneath a robe, no longer a patient's ghost in bedclothes. He still looked thinner than any man should after months of poisoning, and his movements were careful, but there was already something in the set of his shoulders that belonged to the portraits downstairs. Power returning to its body. Then he'll have it, Tendaji said, if he speaks before they can silence him. Malaika turned toward him. Can you make it to the hall? He held her gaze. I can make it far enough. Far enough isn't enough today. No, he said quietly. It isn't. Silence passed between them, heavy. Honest, today would decide whether the next phase of this story happened under law or under burial. Malaika crossed to the table and arranged everything again. The copied medication schedule, the partial revised will. Abeni's notebook, the memo about the bitter taste before collapse, the note linking the home care procurement to suspicious replacement suppliers, and the separate sheet Sade had written from memory about Kojo's confession. Not enough for a courtroom. More than enough to rip open a room built on confidence. She looked at Tendaji. We cannot release everything at once. He nodded. No. We force them to lie first. Malaika understood immediately. That was how men like Jelani destroyed themselves, not by being accused, but by being made to overstate their innocence in public, until evidence turned their certainty into humiliation. At 10:45, the conference floor smelled of polished wood, cold air, and expensive anxiety. The main conference hall of Okoye Holdings sat in a separate wing from the family residence, connected by a glass corridor overlooking the inner gardens. The room itself was designed to impress markets and intimidate doubters. A long ebony table, leather chairs, recessed lighting, silent screens on the walls, waiting to turn data into authority. Today, authority was already seated when Malaika entered. Jelani stood near the head of the table, one hand on a stack of documents, speaking in low tones to a lawyer in a navy suit. Madam Ifeyinwa sat poised and immaculate in dove-grey silk grief reshaped into executive composure. Dr. Chikele was present too, carrying a medical file thick enough to look decisive. Mr. Afolayan sat 3 seats down, expression unreadable but alert. 2 other board members avoided Malaika's eyes altogether, and in the far corner near the side entrance, Kojo stood flanked by a security officer. Not dismissed. Contained. Jelani's gaze lifted the moment Malaika stepped in. Surprise flickered, then irritation, then control. Mrs. Okoye, he said, as if her arrival were mildly inconvenient instead of deeply threatening. "This is a restricted governance meeting." Malaika closed the door behind her. "I am Tendaji Okoye's wife. If this meeting concerns his legal capacity, his health, or the future built around his name, then nothing about it is restricted from me." One of the lawyers began. "Madam, technically," Malaika said, without looking at him, "a great many people in this room have survived by misusing that word." The room tightened. Ifeyinwa folded her hands. "Malaika, dear, nobody is excluding you. We only hoped to spare you distress." That old sentence again. Distress. Protection. Care. The language used by those who wanted obedience to sound tender. Jelani took his place at the head of the table. "Since you insist, let us proceed. We are here because Mr. Tendaji Okoye's prolonged incapacitation now presents material risk to the company, its employees, and its obligations. Dr. Chikele will confirm the medical reality, after which Council will recommend temporary authority measures." Temporary. The favorite lie of power thieves. Dr. Chikele opened the file. "Mr. Okoye remains in a severely compromised neurological state. Lucidity, where it appears, is reflexive and inconsistent. His condition is degenerative and functionally irreversible. He cannot safely manage decision-making." Malaika said nothing. "Not yet. Let him build the noose with his own words." One board member, a heavy-set man with restless fingers, asked, "And there's no realistic expectation of recovery?" Chikele answered smoothly. "None sufficient for executive function." "None?" Malaika asked from her seat. He turned toward her, almost indulgent. "Medically speaking, no." "Interesting." Jelani's jaw shifted. "Do you have relevant information or only grief?" Malaika placed one folded paper on the table and slid it forward. "The medication schedule from the last 7 days," she said. "Please explain why a patient supposedly beyond meaningful recovery required increased sedation immediately after signs of responsiveness." The room changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. A lawyer leaned forward. Mr. Afolayan's eyes sharpened. One of the other board members stopped pretending to check his phone. Chikele did not touch the paper. "Unverified notes prove nothing." "No," Malaika asked. "Then perhaps the nurse who copied them can help." Jelani cut in quickly. "This is absurd." "Is it?" Malaika said. "Then tell the room why your family doctor needed to increase sedatives for a man you insist cannot regain lucidity." Ifeyinwa's voice cooled. "This line of accusation is indecent." Malaika turned to her. "So is poisoning a man slowly enough to make murder look medical. Silence detonated. Not shouting. Worse. The kind of silence in which every person recalculates." Jelani laughed first, because cowards with confidence often did. "There it is. Madness. I wondered how long we would have to wait." He looked around the table, inviting everyone to join him in dismissing her. A few almost did. Then Malaika laid Abini's notebook on the polished wood. Not tossed. Placed deliberately. This belonged to Tendaji's mother. Ifeyinwa's face lost color. Only slightly. But enough. Malaika opened to the marked pages and read aloud. "If anything happens to me, suddenly review the procurement chain tied to home care. I do not trust the replacement specialist Madame Ifeyinwa recommended." She turned the page. Madame collapsed again after tonic. "Doctor says nerves. She says bitterness in the mouth before dizziness." No one moved. Dr. Chikele's expression did not break, but his confidence did. She could see it now in the tension at his mouth. Malaika looked directly at the board. "The same bitterness appears now. The same convenient weakness. The same household control over medication. The same doctor-shaped shadows around a dying heir." Afolayan spoke for the first time. "How did you obtain that notebook?" Malaika met his gaze. The dead hid what the living were too afraid to say aloud. Jelani slammed one palm onto the table. "Enough! This is theft, manipulation, and superstition dressed as evidence. Good, Malaika thought. Push harder. Tendaji entered before anyone else could speak. Not through the main door, through the side entrance behind Kojo. At first, only the security officer noticed. Then Kojo turned. Then Afolayan half rose in his chair. Then the room itself seemed to recoil, as if it had seen a ghost step out of daylight. Tendaji stood in the doorway without support. He was pale, thinner, not yet strong, but alive in a way that no lie could domesticate. Jelani went completely still. Ifeyinwa's lips parted soundlessly. Dr. Chikale took one involuntary step backward. Tendaji crossed the threshold one measured step at a time. Malaika moved toward him instinctively, but he gave the slightest shake of his head. Not yet, let them see. So she stayed where she was. Let them see. He reached the table and rested one hand on the chair at its head, the chair Jelani had been occupying all morning. My condition. Tendaji said, voice rough but unmistakably clear, appears less irreversible than some people hoped. No one in the room breathed properly. Jelani recovered enough to speak. This is irresponsible. He shouldn't be out of bed. Tendaji turned his head slowly. And you shouldn't be in my chair. Jelani stepped back. Just one pace. But everyone saw it. Tendaji lowered himself into the seat with visible effort, but once seated, his presence altered the room completely. Authority did not need full strength to be recognized. It only needed legitimacy and timing. Malaika placed the partial revised will before the board. This was hidden, she said, along with supporting records. Not complete, but enough to show Tendaji had already prepared for interference if he became incapacitated. A lawyer picked it up with trembling caution. This suggests prior concern about coercive governance structures. It does more than suggest, Tendaji said. It confirms what I already suspected before I collapsed. Jelani looked from the papers to Chikale to Ifeyinwa and understood at last that the meeting had slipped beyond management. So he did what desperate men did. He attacked sideways. This woman is manipulating you, he snapped. She came from nowhere, and now suddenly she appears with secret files, hysterical accusations, and servants coached to repeat gossip. Malaika turned toward the corner. Kojo. Every eye followed. The young man froze. Then Tendaji spoke, and his voice carried more power than volume. If you tell the truth now, I will protect you. If you lie for them, they will still destroy you later. Kojo's face crumpled under the weight of terror and opportunity. He looked at Jelani, then at Ifeyinwa, then at Malaika. Finally he spoke. Mr. Jelani told me to lure Mrs. Okoye to the East Gallery during the reception. He said, voice shaking. He said there would be witnesses, that if it looked improper, questions could be raised later about her conduct and motives. A soft sound escaped one of the board members. Shock, disgust, both. Kojo swallowed hard and continued. He also said, I should say the doctor sent for her because she would come faster if Mr. Okoye's name was used. Jelani exploded to his feet. He's lying! But the room had turned against the sound of denial itself, because now denial looked rehearsed. Mr. Afolayan rose slowly. This meeting is suspended, he said, voice firm. No governance action will proceed under a cloud of medical misconduct, witness tampering, and possible estate interference. One of the lawyers nodded at once. I agree. External review is now mandatory. Ifeyinwa's composure finally cracked. You are destroying this family over rumors and a servant boy's fear. Malaika looked at her across the polished table. No, your own choices are doing that. And then, because some truths should not remain buried when the room is finally forced open, she turned toward the door where two additional figures had appeared in the confusion. Moses Kalu and Zainabu, summoned no doubt in case family pressure became useful. Malaika faced them fully. My father sold me into this marriage knowing the house expected Tendaji to die, she said. He discussed my silence with Madame Ifeyinwa. He knew I was chosen because I was poor, isolated, and easy to dispose of once widowhood made me inconvenient. Moses went white. Zainabu's mouth opened, but no defense came. The room had already judged. Not legally, morally, and sometimes that was where power began to rot fastest. Moses took one stumbling step forward. "Malaika, listen." "No," she said. "Just that. No." The syllable landed harder than any scream, because it stripped him of the right to narrate her pain for 1 second longer. Around the table no one looked at him with respect anymore, not even the people equally guilty, especially not them. Predators hated seeing another predator exposed too plainly. It reminded them how thin their own skin was. Then, to everyone's astonishment, Moses dropped to his knees. Not out of love, out of fear. "Please," he whispered hoarsely, "do not ruin us." Zainabu followed 1/2 a second later, pride shattered by the mathematics of disgrace. "Malaika, please." Malaika stared at them. This was the image they had never imagined, not because they believed she lacked strength, but because they had trained themselves never to see it. Her father kneeling, her sister begging, a man who had sold her and a woman who had helped price her, now asking mercy from the daughter they had treated like excess burden. Tendaji's hand moved once on the table beside hers. Not to restrain, not to guide, simply there, witnessing. Malaika's voice when it came was calm. "You should have thought about mercy before you traded mine away." The begging began before the law arrived. That was the first thing Malaika understood as the conference hall dissolved into controlled chaos. People liked to imagine justice entered, wearing uniforms, carrying warrants, speaking in formal language. But real justice often entered a room earlier than that in the instant power realized it was no longer being believed. The board meeting had ended without ceremony. Lawyers were already making calls. Mr. Afolayan had demanded an independent medical review, a full freeze on emergency succession measures, and secured transport for Tendaji to be examined by outside specialists before anyone in the Okoye household could interfere again. Security officers, suddenly uncertain which loyalty would keep their jobs alive, stood in shifting silence near the doors. Kojo was escorted away under Afolayan's instruction, no longer as disposable staff, but as a protected witness. And still before any official authority crossed the threshold, the first pleas had come. From Moses, from Zainabu, from Ifeyinwa, though hers had been phrased less like begging and more like offended negotiation. Now, 2 hours later, the mansion itself seemed to be trembling under the weight of what it knew. Malaika stood in the east drawing room, while outside the afternoon sun burned gold across the gardens, as if the day had not split open at all. On the long table near the windows lay the evidence that had cracked everything apart. Abini's notebook, the copied will pages, the revised medication schedule, and a handwritten record of Kojo's statement. Each object looked small, harmless even. Yet together they had done what money, grief, and intimidation had failed to prevent. They had forced truth into the open. Behind her footsteps approached. Tendaji. He was dressed now in a charcoal suit borrowed from the back of his own untouched wardrobe, the jacket hanging looser than it once would have, his body still recovering from months of calculated weakness. But he no longer looked like a man arranged for death. He looked like a man returning from it. He paused beside her at the window. "The police are here," he said. Malaika nodded once. Through the glass she could see 2 dark vehicles beyond the inner gate. Men and women in official jackets were being led toward the administrative wing where the corporate records were kept. Dr. Chikele had already tried to leave once and been stopped by counsel. Jelani had locked himself in a study for 20 minutes making frantic calls. No one important was answering anymore. Ifeyinwa had requested privacy. Privacy prayer and calm in that order. None of it had restored her power. "Mr. Afolayan moved faster than I expected," Malaika said. Tendaji gave a faint, tired smile. He always hated waste. He'll consider this an inefficient coup attempt. Despite everything, a brief breath of laughter escaped her. Then silence settled again, not awkward, not empty, but full of everything that had survived long enough to matter. Tendaji turned toward her fully. "You saved my life." Malaika kept her eyes on the officers crossing the courtyard. "I helped you stay alive." "No," he said quietly. "You did more than that." She looked at him then. There was no performance left in his face, no executive polish, no strategic distance, only truth exhausted and unmistakable. "You walked into a house built to consume people weaker than itself," he said. "You had every reason to save yourself first. Instead, you chose to see what everyone else was paid not to see." Malaika lowered her gaze for a moment. "Maybe because I knew what it felt like to be the person no one saved. The words remained between them. Not fragile, sacred." Tendaji's voice deepened with restrained anger. "Then every person who made that true for you will live long enough to understand what it cost." That, more than any promise of romance, went straight to the wounded center of her. Not because he spoke of revenge, because he spoke of recognition. He understood that some injuries were not erased by love alone. They had to be named, witnessed, answered. A knock sounded. Neither of them moved at first. Then Saad entered. For the first time since Malaika had known her, Sade did not look like a woman trying to make herself smaller. She looked shaken, yes, but upright inside herself. "Madame Ifeyinwa is asking to speak with you," she said. "Alone." Malaika's expression did not change. "No." Sade hesitated. "She says it concerns your father." "Of course it did. When cruel people lost their power, they immediately reached for whatever pain they believed still belonged to you." Tendaji stepped forward. "You don't owe her an audience." "No," Malaika said, "but I may owe myself one." Minutes later, she entered the blue sitting room, where so many arrangements had been made over her life, as if she were absent from it. Ifeyinwa stood by the fireplace, still elegant, still composed enough to insult the room. But the edges were gone now. The invisible armor of certainty had cracked. Her beauty no longer looked untouchable. It looked expensive and tired. Moses sat on the far sofa, head in both hands. Zainabu stood near the wall, eyes swollen from crying, though Malaika had no desire to guess whether those tears were shame, fear, or self-pity. Ifeyinwa turned first. "Malaika," she said, "before this goes any further, I want you to understand something. Houses like this survive by managing damage. If you keep pushing, the scandal will swallow everyone, including you." Malaika stopped in the center of the room. There it was. Not apology, not remorse, strategy. Even now. "You still think I'm afraid of disgrace," Malaika said. Ifeyinwa's eyes sharpened. "You should be. The world forgives powerful men more easily than scandalous women." "Yes," Malaika said, "and women like you help keep it that way." That landed. Moses rose clumsily from the sofa. "Daughter." "Do not call me that now." He went still. Zainabu finally spoke, voice shaking. "We were desperate." Malaika turned to look at her. "No. You were selfish. Desperation cries. Selfishness calculates." Zainabu flinched. Moses took one step forward, hands half lifted in supplication. "I thought if you married into wealth, your life would improve." Malaika's stare did not soften. "You thought if I suffered quietly, yours would." No one in the room denied it. And that silence gave her something rage alone never could. Closure. Not healing yet, not peace, but the clean, terrible closure of hearing guilt refused to disguise itself any longer. Ifeyinwa changed tactics quickly. Tendaji is emotional. Weak. You have influence over him now. Use it wisely. A criminal proceeding will stain the company, damage the share value, and poison his future. There are quieter solutions. Malaika almost smiled. Because there it was, the true prayer of people who had mistaken silence for dignity all their lives. Quieter solutions. Bury it well enough and call the grave maturity. No, Malaika said. What poisoned his future was what you did to him. What poisoned this house was what you did to his mother. What poisoned me was what all of you agreed I was worth. Ifeyinwa's face finally changed. Not dramatically, but the mask slipped enough to show something raw beneath it. Fear, real fear. For the first time, she understood she was not speaking to a temporary girl in a forced marriage. She was speaking to the woman who had survived the trap and remembered every hand that built it. Moses dropped to his knees again. This time closer. Malaika, he whispered. Please, if they charge me, I lose everything. She looked down at him. Years of hunger, years of silence, years of swallowing pain because older people called it respect, years of being measured by usefulness instead of love. All of it stood in the room with her, and yet the thing she felt most strongly was not triumph. It was distance. He was no longer large enough to terrify her. You should lose everything built from selling someone who trusted you, she said. His face collapsed. Zainabu began to cry harder. Please don't destroy us. Malaika's voice stayed calm. I am not destroying you. I am refusing to keep protecting what you did. She turned and left them there, not because she lacked words, because she had finally learned the difference between explanation and release. By evening, the removals had begun. Dr. Chikale was escorted out under investigation for medical misconduct, document falsification, and potential conspiracy. Jelani, after attempting one final performance of outrage, was formally suspended from all executive access, pending criminal and corporate review. Ifeyinwa's accounts and private correspondence were seized for examination. The administrative archive was sealed. Board counsel took statements from staff one by one, and the servants who had spent years lowering their eyes now began cautiously to speak. Not all at once, not heroically. Truth rarely arrived like that. It came in pieces. In remembered instructions, in dates, in repeated smells, in one maid admitting she had been told never to question sedatives, in a driver recalling envelopes passed after hospital visits, in a steward confessing he had altered visitor logs on command. A house that had trained itself to silence had begun little by little to loosen. 3 days later, Tendaji gave his first public statement, not from the mansion, from a rehabilitation clinic chosen by independent counsel with doctors who answered to medicine instead of money. Malaika stood beside him, not behind. Cameras flashed. Journalists leaned forward. The city watched the man it had almost buried sit upright and speak in a voice still rough but no longer fading. He did not begin with the company. He began with her. My wife Malaika Okoye saved my life when many people with greater status, education, and power chose convenience over truth. Everything that follows today is possible because she refused to believe that cruelty becomes respectable when hidden inside family medicine or wealth. Malaika felt the words hit the room like clean fire, not because they praised her, because they restored her publicly. Every lie that had framed her as opportunist burden, village girl, decorative widow, unstable wife, he shattered all of them in one sentence. Then he announced the legal actions, the internal audits, the succession freeze, and the reopening of inquiries related to Abeni Okoye's death. The city erupted, and with it the begging returned. Messages, calls, intermediaries, church elders, distant relatives, Men who had once praised Moses now urging mercy. Women who had ignored Malaika's suffering now warning her not to become too hard. Former allies of Ife Yinhua offering apologies shaped like bargaining chips. Malaika listened to none of them. Mercy, she had learned, was not the same thing as removing consequence. Weeks later, when the first legal hearings began and the Okoye mansion stood half empty under investigation, Tendaji brought Malaika back there one last time, not to reclaim the house as it had been, to redefine what remained. In the old central courtyard where fear had once spread faster than sunlight, workers had already begun removing the cameras Jelani installed and reopening quarters long kept under quiet control. Sade stood nearby, no longer in servant grey, but in simple navy, newly appointed head of household operations under an interim team. Tendaji turned to Malaika. "I want to sell part of the estate." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because too much of it was fed by rot." He paused. "And because I want something cleaner built from what survives." So they did. Over the following months, a portion of the Okoye family holdings funded two things. The first was the Abeni Foundation, named for the woman whose warnings had nearly been buried with her. It provided legal aid, emergency shelter, and medical support for women pressured into forced marriages, coerced family deals, and abusive dependency. The second was a recovery center for patients whose care had been manipulated, neglected, or corrupted by private power. On opening day, Malaika stood before a small crowd of women, nurses, lawyers, and survivors. Some were bruised by life in visible ways. Others looked untouched until you saw their eyes. She spoke without trembling. "They taught many of us that endurance was the highest form of virtue," she said. "But endurance without truth only teaches evil people how long they can keep hurting you. Healing begins the day you stop protecting the story that destroyed you." Tendaji watched her from the side of the stage, and in his face she saw something she had not known how to trust when this began. Not gratitude alone. Partnership. By the time the sun lowered that evening, the center's courtyard filled with ordinary sounds. Women talking, children laughing, staff carrying boxes, someone testing music from a phone speaker. Life. Messy, unstaged life. Nothing like the polished silence of the mansion. Malaika stood in the warm light and understood what made this victory complete. Not that the guilty had fallen, not even that the innocent had survived, but that the suffering meant to silence her and become shelter for others. The girl they sold had not simply escaped. She had returned with the truth, saved the man they meant to bury, and forced every hand that helped build the trap to kneel before consequence. And in the end, the mercy she chose was not forgetting. It was building a world in which fewer women would ever need to beg for their dignity again. Some betrayals do not come from enemies. They come from the very people who taught you to call their control, love, their greed, sacrifice, and your silence respect. That is why stories like Malaika's hurt so deeply. They remind us that injustice becomes most dangerous when it hides inside family beauty tradition and polished appearances. But this story also gives something stronger than pain. It gives proof that truth does not need to begin with power. Sometimes it begins with one person noticing what everyone else has agreed to ignore. One person refusing to swallow the lie. One person deciding that kindness is not weakness and endurance is not the same as surrender. Malaika did not win because life was fair to her. She won because once she saw the truth, she stopped protecting the people who benefited from her suffering. And when that happened, everything changed. The guilty lost their shield. The wounded found language. The dead were finally honored. The living were finally saved. Real healing is not pretending nothing happened. Real healing is facing what happened, fully naming it clearly, and then choosing to build something that gives pain no more power over the future. If this story moved you, tell me where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. And And if you believe truth, justice, and healing matter, subscribe and stay with us for more powerful stories like this.